In the pale, wind-scored October of 1983, a 29-year-old woman named Sage Whitaker stood on the hood of a borrowed flatbed truck and looked out over 80 acres of what the county assessor had officially classified as non-productive rangeland. That was the polite term. The locals in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, which sits at the very tip of the panhandle like a finger pointing accusingly at Colorado, had other names for it. They called it Teague's Folly. They called it the Boneyard. One old rancher, a man whose humor was as dry as the country itself, simply called it proof that God makes mistakes too. The land was a wound. Decades of relentless cattle grazing had stripped the native grasses down to nothing. What remained was a cracked, pale hardpan of caliche and red dust, punctuated by clumps of invasive Russian thistle, the tumbleweeds that are the unofficial mascot of failure in the western plains. In the low spots, erosion had carved shallow gullies that spread across the surface like varicose veins. A single rusted windmill stood near the center of the property, its blades frozen in a permanent state of surrender, one of them bent at a sickening angle. It had not pumped water in a decade. The well beneath it was dry. The land had been listed for 3 years. Nobody wanted it. Nobody would want it. Sage had driven 14 hours from Tulsa to stand on this truck hood. She had quit her job at the county clerk's office, a steady paycheck with benefits and a small, predictable life attached to it. She had liquidated her modest savings account, which contained $6,200, the sum total of 4 years of disciplined living and denied pleasures. And she had come here to the driest, emptiest, most forsaken corner of her own state to buy land that everyone, and I mean everyone, said was worth less than the paper the deed was printed on. The man selling it was Harmon Teague, a third-generation rancher whose family had once run cattle across 3,000 acres. That empire had been whittled down by drought, debt, and the slow, grinding economics of commodity beef. Harmon was 72. He was selling his last 80 acres because his wife needed a surgery in Amarillo, and Medicare didn't cover all of it. He stood by the truck, his face like a piece of old leather that had been left in the rain and then baked in the sun, watching this young woman from Tulsa survey his legacy of dust. "It's yours if you want it," Harmon said, and his voice carried no salesmanship, only exhaustion. "County appraised it at $4,000. I'll take 3. Honestly, I'd have taken 2 if you'd offered. I just want it off my books." Sage paid him $3,500 in a cashier's check. She paid more than he asked because something in her refused to profit from a man's desperation. It was, she understood later, the most important financial decision she ever made, not because of the $500 extra, but because Harmon Teague remembered it. But that part of the story comes later. Let me tell you about Sage Whitaker and where she learned to see the world the way she did, because that is the heart of this whole thing. Sage's grandmother, Hazel Whitaker, had been born in 1912 in a dugout sod house in Beaver County, not 40 miles from where Sage now stood. Hazel was a child of the original Dust Bowl, that great American catastrophe of the 1930s when the plains turned to powder and blew away, taking farms, fortunes, and futures with it. Most people who survived the Dust Bowl learned one lesson from it. Leave. Get out. Go to California. The land is broken, and it will break you too. Hazel learned a different lesson. She stayed, and she watched. She watched what happened on the margins, in the places where the plows hadn't reached. She noticed that along the creek banks and on the rocky hillsides, where no one had ever bothered to turn the soil, the land held, the grass held, the topsoil held, the native blue spruceum, and buffalo grass and Indian grass, with their roots that reached 10 feet into the earth, had locked the soil in place, while the wheat fields on either side turned to dunes. The land that had never been broken was the land that never broke. Hazel spent her life studying what she called the memory of the prairie. She believed the land remembered what it was supposed to be, and that if you stopped fighting it long enough, it would tell you. She kept journals, dozens of them. Not farming ledgers with yields and expenses, but ecological diaries. She recorded rainfall to the hundredth of an inch. She noted which wildflowers bloomed first after a dry winter and which birds returned earliest in spring. She documented the movement patterns of the pronghorn that still wandered the open range. She pressed seeds between the pages. When Sage was a girl, she spent her summers with Hazel in her small frame house outside of Forgan. Her grandmother would take her on long walks across the untouched stretches of public land, pointing out the architecture of the prairie. "See that?" Hazel would say, gesturing to a thick stand of switchgrass bending in the wind. "That grass right there, its roots go down deeper than you are tall. Every inch of root is holding soil. Every inch of soil is holding water. That's not a field, child. That's a bank account. The grass makes deposits every year. The roots grow. The soil deepens. The water table rises. A wheat farmer, he makes withdrawals. Year after year, he withdraws. He never deposits. And then one day, the account is empty, and he blames the weather." Hazel had one other belief that the modern ranching community found particularly absurd. She believed that cattle, specifically the European breeds that dominated American ranching, Herefords, Angus, the heavy, docile, grain-fattened animals that the industry was built upon, were the wrong animal for the western plains. They were not designed for this landscape. They were water-hungry, heat-intolerant, and their grazing pattern was destructive. They cropped grass down to the dirt and then stood on the bare ground, compacting it with their weight, sealing it against rain like a coat of varnish. A herd of cattle on dry rangeland, Hazel wrote in a 1968 journal entry, was like a slow-motion plow. Given enough time, they will create another dust bowl. The animal that was designed for this place, the one that had shaped the prairie and been shaped by it over 10,000 years, was already here before we replaced it. We did not improve the land by removing the buffalo. We began its destruction. Now, I want you to understand the world Sage Whitaker walked into when she arrived in Cimarron County in the autumn of 1983 with her deed and her grandmother's journals and her plan. This was cattle country, not just economically, but culturally, spiritually, and in every way that mattered to the people who lived there. The ranchers of the Oklahoma Panhandle were beef men. Their grandfathers had been beef men. Their sense of identity, their social standing, their very definition of what it meant to be a man or a woman of the land was tied to cattle. The pickup trucks had cattle brands on the doors. The high school mascot was a longhorn. The bank's logo was a cow. To suggest, as Sage was about to suggest, that cattle were part of the problem was not merely an agricultural opinion. It was heresy. Sage's plan was this. She would not run cattle. She would restore the native prairie grasses on her 80 acres. Using seed she would collect herself from the few remaining untouched patches of original grassland in the county. And then, once the grass was established, she would introduce a small herd of American bison. The logic was to her as clear and elegant as her grandmother's handwriting. The bison and the grass had co-evolved. The bison grazed differently than cattle. They moved constantly, never staying in one spot long enough to destroy it. They ate the tops of the grass and moved on, their heavy hooves pressing seeds into the soil as they went. Their waste fertilized the ground. Their movement patterns created a natural cycle of grazing and recovery that mimicked the great herds that had once numbered in the tens of millions. The grass would feed the bison would feed the grass, and the land, given this partnership, would begin to heal. she would sell two things. First, the bison meat itself, which she had researched extensively at the Tulsa Public Library. It was leaner than beef, lower in cholesterol, higher in protein, and a small but growing market on the coasts was paying premium prices for it. Second, and this was the part even she considered a gamble, she would harvest and sell the native grass seed itself. The federal government, through the Soil Conservation Service, was beginning to talk about prairie restoration. Ranchers who wanted to participate in conservation programs needed native seed, and almost no one was producing it commercially. She would be selling the cure for the disease that everyone else was still spreading. 2 harvests from one piece of land, 1 animal, 1 grass, 1 system. The bison builds the prairie feeds the bison, and both produce a cash crop. She explained this plan exactly once in a public setting, and it was enough to cement her reputation for years. It happened at the Cimarron County Farm Bureau meeting in November of 1983. Sage had gone because she needed information about water rights. She sat in the back row of the community center, a young woman in a room full of weathered men in pearl-snap shirts and sweat-stained hats. She had not intended to speak, but Mr. Strickland, the bureau president and the owner of the Strickland Ranch Supply, the only place within 100 miles to buy fencing, feed, or veterinary supplies, had noticed her name on the sign-in sheet. "I see we have a new landowner," Mr. Strickland said from the podium, smiling the way a man smiles when he's about to provide entertainment at someone else's expense. "Miss Whitaker, stand up and tell us about your operation. What are you running out there on the old Teague place?" Every head turned. Sage stood up. She could feel the weight of the room. She kept her voice even and explained, in simple terms, what she intended to do. Restore the grass, bring in bison, sell the meat and the seed. She spoke for maybe 3 minutes. The silence that followed was thick enough to lean on. Then a man in the 3rd row, a rancher named Curtis Yarbrough, whose family had been in the county since statehood, leaned back in his folding chair, crossed his arms, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "So you're telling us you bought 80 acres of dirt and your plan is to grow weeds and raise buffalo?" He let the word sit in the air. Buffalo. He said it the way Mr. Boudreaux in Louisiana once said bugs, with a deliberate, dismissive reduction. "Sweetheart, that's not ranching. That's a science project." The room laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Mr. Strickland, to his credit, tried to quiet it, but his own smile betrayed him. The meeting moved on. Sage sat back down, burning her hands steady in her lap. She did not speak again that evening. She drove home in the dark, the headlights of the borrowed truck cutting through the flat, empty darkness of the panhandle. She parked, went inside the small, leaking single-wide trailer she was renting on the edge of her property, sat on the floor, and opened one of her grandmother's journals. She found an entry from 1936, the worst year of the Dust Bowl. "The wind took the Hendersons' wheat field today," Hazel had written. "All of it. 800 acres of topsoil gone in an afternoon." Mr. Henderson stood at the edge and wept. He said the land had betrayed him, but the land did not betray him. He betrayed the land. He tore out the grass that held it together and planted wheat that held nothing. He took and never gave back. The land simply did what land does when it is left with nothing to hold. It let go. Sage closed the journal. She did not cry. She set her alarm for 5 in the morning and went to bed. The work that followed was staggering. She had no equipment. She had no employees. She had, after the land purchase, roughly $2,700 to her name. She could not afford bison yet. She could not afford seed yet. What she could afford was labor, her own, and she spent it without reservation. She spent the first full year on her hands and knees, not metaphorically. Literally, she crawled across the 80 acres with a hand rake, a pair of canvas bags, and an old field guide to Great Plains grasses. She was looking for survivors among the Russian thistle and the cheatgrass and the bare, crusted dirt. She searched for any remnant of the original prairie. A single clump of buffalo grass clinging to the lee side of a rock, a tuft of blue grama hiding in the shadow of a fence post, Sidioat's grama growing in a hairline crack in the caliche. She found them. Not many, but enough. Each one was a thread of the original fabric, and she collected their seeds with the reverence of a woman gathering jewels. She supplemented these finds with seeds she gathered from roadsides, from the edges of cemeteries where the land had never been plowed, from the margins of dry creek beds. She drove hundreds of miles on weekends, a coffee can in one hand and a pair of scissors in the other, clipping seed heads from native grasses wherever she could find them. People saw her on the side of the highway, squatting in the ditch, harvesting what they saw as weeds. One rancher who passed her regularly later told the story at the feed store. Saw that Whitaker girl picking grass seeds off the side of Route 56 like she was collecting gold nuggets. I tell you, the sun has cooked that woman's brain. She broadcast the seed by hand, walking her fields in long, overlapping rows, just as Marie Fontenot had done with rice in Louisiana 2 decades earlier. Though Sage had never heard that story and never would, she planted in the fall, as the native grasses preferred, and she waited through the long, dry, merciless winter. The first spring, almost nothing came up. The soil was so compacted, so dead, so stripped of organic matter that the seeds simply sat on the surface and blew away or were eaten by birds. She lost nearly an entire season's work. The $2,700 was now $1,100. She was eating beans and rice 3 meals a day. She did not quit. She adjusted. She went to the county dump, and she made an arrangement with the manager, a bored, indifferent man who was happy to have someone haul away his problem. She took loads of decomposing organic waste, kitchen scraps, rotting hay, old leaves, anything that had once been alive, and she spread it across her fields with a pitchfork. She was building soil, inch by inch, load by load. It was, in the most literal sense possible, making something from nothing. The smell was extraordinary. The neighbors noticed. She planted again the second fall, pressing the seeds into the thin layer of new organic matter she had created. And this time, when spring came, the grass came with it. Not thick, not lush, just a faint green blush across the brown, like the first pale light before sunrise. But it was there. The roots were reaching down. The system was beginning to breathe. Now, let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment in your life where the evidence against you was so overwhelming, so unanimous, that you began to doubt the one thing you knew to be true? Not because you had lost faith in your idea, but because the loneliness of believing it had started to erode something inside you. Sage had that moment in her second winter. She was 31 years old, alone in a leaking trailer on the edge of the Oklahoma Panhandle, her hands cracked and bleeding from the cold, her bank account nearly empty, and the thin, fragile grass on her fields looked so tenuous, so improbable against the vast, indifferent plain, that for one long, terrible night, she thought about calling her cousin in Tulsa and asking if the clerk's office would take her back. She didn't make the call. She opened a journal instead. The Bison came in the spring of 1986, 3 years after she bought the land. She could afford exactly 7 animals, 4 cows and 3 yearlings, purchased from a small herd in South Dakota. The trucker who delivered them charged her extra for the distance and the inconvenience. "Lady," he said, backing the trailer up to her newly built fence, a fence she had strung herself, post by post, from cedars she'd cut on a friend's property in the Wichita Mountains. "I've hauled a lot of strange things, but this is a first. You sure you know what you're doing with these? They ain't cows. They don't act like cows. They don't think like cows. Sage just nodded and opened the gate. The moment those 7 bison stepped onto her land is a moment she would describe years later as the moment the land exhaled. They moved differently than cattle. There was no plodding, no standing in one spot, no crowding around a single water trough. They spread out. They grazed in a loose, moving pattern, their great shaggy heads sweeping through the young grass, eating, then walking, eating, then walking. Within a week, she could see their effect. Where they had grazed, the grass was shorter but not gone. Where their hooves had pressed into the soil, she found seeds pushed into the earth, perfectly planted. Where they had dropped their waste, the ground was dark and rich. It was working. The duet was playing, but the world outside her fence line was not cheering. The bison made her a target. Cattle ranchers do not like bison. This is not an abstraction. In the 1980s, in the Oklahoma Panhandle, bison were considered a threat, a nuisance, and a provocation. Ranchers feared they would break through fences and mingle with cattle herds, spreading disease. They feared the precedent that if bison ranching proved viable, it would undermine the cultural and economic foundation of the beef industry. They feared, most of all, being proven wrong. The trouble started small. Anonymous complaints to the county about her fencing. An inspector showed up, measured the height, the post spacing, the wire gauge. Everything was to code. He told her so, apologetically, and left. Then her mailbox was knocked down, twice. Then someone left a dead coyote on her gate with a note that read, "This is what happens to things that don't belong." Sage reported nothing. She fixed the mailbox. She buried the coyote. She strung her fence tighter. The grass, meanwhile, was performing a quiet miracle. By the end of the 3rd growing season with the bison, the transformation was visible from the road. Where there had been bare, cracked hardpan, there was now a continuous carpet of mixed native grasses, green in spring and summer, golden in fall, the colors shifting in the wind like the surface of an inland sea. The soil, tested by a sympathetic professor from Oklahoma State who had heard about her project, had increased its organic matter content by over 300%. Its water infiltration rate, the speed at which it could absorb rain, had improved by a factor of 5. The land was holding water. The land that had been dead for a generation was holding water, and the bison herd was growing. The 4 cows produced 4 calves the first year. Sage sold none of them. She let the herd build. By 1989, 6 years in, she had 22 animals. She sold her first 3 bulls that fall to a restaurant supplier in Denver who specialized in what he called heritage protein. He paid her $4.20 a pound, hanging weight. Beef at the time was bringing ranchers roughly $1.60. She made more from 3 bison than most of her neighbors made from 20 head of cattle. But the second income stream, the one Sage had gambled on, the one even she had considered uncertain, was the one that changed everything: the native grass seed. In 1985, the federal government had passed the Conservation Reserve Program, paying farmers to take highly erodible land out of production and plant it with permanent ground cover. The program required native grass seed, and there was almost none available. Commercial seed companies had spent decades developing improved varieties of fescue and Bermuda grass, the tame, domesticated grasses that were easy to grow and easy to sell. Nobody had been cultivating the wild, native species, the big bluestem and switchgrass and Sidioids grama, that the program demanded. Nobody except Sage Whitaker. She had 80 acres of it. She had been harvesting seed for her own use since the 2nd year. She had more than she needed. She made a phone call to the Soil Conservation Service office in Guymon, and when the district conservationist drove out to see her fields, he stood at the edge of her property for a full minute without speaking. "I've been in this job for 18 years, he said finally. "I've never seen native prairie this healthy on private land in this county." "How much seed can you produce?" she told him. He asked if she could double it. She said she could if she had a proper seed harvester. He said the SCS had a cost-share program that could help with that. Within a year, she had a small, pull-behind, native grass seed harvester. And she was filling orders for the federal government, for state highway departments who needed erosion control, for other ranchers who were enrolling in the conservation program and needed the exact seeds that Sage had been collecting from roadsides and cemeteries for years. The math was extraordinary. Her bison operation was producing a premium product at minimal cost because the land fed the animals and the animals fed the land. No purchased feed, no fertilizer, no veterinary bills for the diseases of confinement. And her seed operation was harvesting a product that literally grew out of the same system, requiring no additional inputs, no additional land, no additional labor beyond the harvest itself. 2 incomes, 1 system, 1 piece of land that everyone, not 6 years ago, had called worthless. Let me tell you what happened with Mr. Strickland, because this is the part you've been waiting for, whether you know it or not. In the summer of 1991, 8 years after Sage bought the land, a drought hit the Oklahoma Panhandle. It was not a biblical drought, not a dust bowl, but it was bad enough. The summer rains didn't come. The stock ponds dried up. The improved pastures, the Bermuda and fescue that every rancher in the county relied on, turned brown and crisp by July. Ranchers were hauling water. Ranchers were buying hay at twice the normal price from Kansas and Texas. Ranchers were selling cattle at a loss because they couldn't afford to feed them. The mood in the county was grim, desperate, and angry. And on the old Teague place, the grass was green. Not brilliantly green, not lush, but green. The deep-rooted native grasses, with their 10-foot root systems that the Sage's grandmother had marveled at decades earlier, were reaching water that the shallow-rooted tame grasses could not touch. The bison were grazing calmly, unbothered, adapted to drought as their ancestors had been for millennia. Sage's operation didn't just survive the drought of 1991. It barely noticed it. People drove past her land that summer. They slowed down. They looked at the green fields surrounded by brown, and they felt something complicated stirring in their chests. It was not admiration, not yet. It was something closer to the vertigo you feel when a fundamental assumption cracks beneath your feet. Mr. Strickland came on a Tuesday in September. Sage saw his white jewelry truck, the one with the Strickland Ranch Supply decal on the door, coming down her gravel road, trailing a plume of dust that hung in the still air like a signal flare. She was on the porch, cleaning a seed screen. She set it down and waited. He got out slowly. He was not a small man, and the drought had aged him. His own ranch, 1,200 acres of improved pasture and registered Hereford cattle, was hemorrhaging money. He had sold 40 head that month at prices that made him sick. His hay bill was more than his mortgage. He stood by his truck for a moment, looking at the field, at the dark, moving shapes of the bison, at the grass that swayed in the hot wind, alive and green in a county that was turning to powder. He walked to the porch. He took off his hat. This was significant. In ranch country, a man removes his hat in church, at a funeral, and when he is admitting something that costs him. "Miss Whitaker," he said. He did not use her first name. The formality was deliberate, a small act of respect that had been absent 8 years earlier. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know it's not easy for me to be standing here." "I know it isn't," Sage said. She did not make him more comfortable. She did not offer him a chair, but her voice was not unkind. "My south pasture is gone," he said, "burned up. I've got 200 head and nothing to put under them. I've been ranching this country for 35 years. and my daddy ranched it for 30 before that, and I have never, not once, seen a piece of ground in this county look like yours does right now." He paused. His jaw worked. "I need to know what you know. I need to know how you did this. And I need to know if there's any of that grass seed available, because the SCS man tells me you're the only supplier in the state." Sage looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the Farm Bureau meeting. She thought about the word sweetheart. She thought about the dead coyote on her gate, which she had never been able to prove was connected to anyone in particular, and which she had never mentioned to a soul. Then she thought about her grandmother, who had shared her knowledge with anyone who asked, who had believed that the prairie's survival depended not on one person being right, but on enough people learning to listen. "I have seed," she said, "and I have time this afternoon if you want to walk the fields." They walked for 2 hours. She showed him the root structure of the big blue stem, pulling a clump from the earth so he could see the dense, fibrous network that reached down past his arm's length. She showed him the bison's grazing pattern, how they moved through the grass in a wave, never staying, never stripping. She showed him the soil itself, dark and crumbly and alive with earthworms, and she asked him to compare it with a handful from his own pasture, which he had brought in a plastic bag, almost unconsciously, as if he had known this moment was coming. His soil was pale, compacted, lifeless. The contrast did not require explanation. At the end of the walk, Mr. Strickland stood at the gate and put his hat back on. He looked out at the field one more time. "I owe you an apology," he said, "not just for what I said at that meeting, but for what I thought. I thought you were a foolish girl playing at something she didn't understand. I was wrong. You understood something the rest of us were too proud or too blind to see." He cleared his throat. "If you ever need anything from my store, anything at all, it's yours at cost, and I mean that." "Thank you, Miss Strickland," Sage said. "But what I'd really like is for you to come to the next Farm Bureau meeting and tell them what you saw today." He did. "Let me take you to the long view now, because that is where the real weight of this story lives." Sage Whitaker never became a cattle baron. She never bought 1,000 acres or a fleet of shiny trucks. She stayed on her 80 acres, which she eventually expanded to 240. All of it land her neighbors had considered wasteland. All of it purchased with cash generated by the system her grandmother had envisioned and she had built. She lived in a modest house she had built to replace the leaking trailer, a house made of native stone and reclaimed timber, debt-free and warm in winter. The bison herd grew to 60 animals. The Denver restaurant supplier became a long-term contract. 2 more restaurants in Oklahoma City and 1 in Dallas were added. The meat sold at a premium that never dropped below 3 times the going rate for conventional beef, because the market for grass-finished bison was growing faster than the supply. The seed business grew larger. The Conservation Reserve Program enrolled millions of acres across the Great Plains, and every one of those acres needed native seed. Sage became the primary supplier for 3 SCS districts. She trained her neighbors to harvest seed from their own restored pastures, creating a cooperative that eventually served half the state. But the thing that mattered most, the thing Sage herself would tell you about if you sat on her porch and asked, was the change in the land itself. By 2005, 22 years after she had stood on the hood of that borrowed truck and looked out over a wasteland, her original 80 acres had been studied by researchers from 3 universities. The soil carbon levels had increased by 400%. The water table beneath her property had risen by 11 feet. Species of birds and insects that had not been documented in the county for decades were found on her land. The prairie, the real prairie, the one her grandmother had known as a child before the plows and the cattle and the dust had taken it, was coming back. If you drive through Cimarron County today, you will see it. Not everywhere, not yet, but here and there, among the conventional ranches, with their tired fescue and their struggling herds, you will see fields of native grass, tall and thick and moving in the wind. You will see the dark, humped shapes of bison grazing in that ancient, restless pattern. You will see signs along the road that read, "Native seed available," and "Grass-finished bison." An idea that a roomful of ranchers once called a science project has become a part of the landscape, a quiet, growing revolution that started with one woman, one piece of dead land, and a box of her grandmother's journals. On a spring evening, you might drive past a stone house set back from a gravel road. On the porch, you might see a woman in her 70s, her hands rough and brown, her eyes sharp, sitting in a cedar rocking chair with a girl of 10 or 11 beside her. Between them, on a small table, sits a stack of worn notebooks, the pages yellowed, the handwriting faded but still legible. The woman is pointing to a passage, reading it aloud, her voice carrying across the porch and out into the evening air where the grass is turning gold in the last light, and a small herd of bison is moving, slowly and deliberately, across the open plain. The men at the Farm Bureau saw a young woman from Tulsa with no cattle, no husband, and no sense. They saw 80 acres of dust and a head full of dreams. They saw the end of a very short story. But the land, the patient, ancient, remembering land, saw something else entirely. It saw a woman who was willing to stop shouting and start listening. It saw the one thing it had been waiting for through decades of abuse and neglect and disappointment. It saw a partner, and it answered her the only way land knows how, not with words, but with roots and green and life, season after season after season, a harvest that has not yet reached its end.